It's been over 18 months since the original version of the Final Fantasy VII Remake released on the PlayStation 4, and even though we have yet to receive any word as to when the next part will release and on what platforms it will appear, Square Enix has still divulged a considerable amount of information about what we can expect to see from what at the moment is still being referred to as the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. And that applies to the project as a whole, the direction the story and gameplay will take, and who will be at the helm. As there has been no official reveal from Square Enix, much of the information about Part 2 has come from indirect conversations had with senior figures. These have appeared as off-the-cuff remarks in interviews about other projects, often as subtle suggestions or hints. But we have also been able to glean changes in approach based on how feedback was addressed after gamers around the world voiced their opinions when the first game was released. Throughout this video, we're going to take an extensive deep dive, compiling every morsel of information we could find about the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, and we're going to do so in our typical granular style. But before we do, we have an important update of our own. After a ton of work behind the scenes, we have launched a Kickstarter campaign for our first book, which we are calling The Legacy of the Crystal. We are now a week into the campaign and have smashed our initial goal, something that means that every backer will now receive a free foil-stamped bookmark. But the journey has only just begun. If this is the first you're hearing about the project though, The Legacy of the Crystal will serve as a comprehensive encyclopedic book that will explore the entire Final Fantasy franchise. It will feature 127 games with a focus placed on main numbered entries into the franchise, as well as every sequel, spin-off and remake. The book will contain approximately 60,000 words, with each game featuring a condensed version of what you might expect from our history of videos. There will be historical commentary that looks at the reasons behind a game's creation, philosophies the developers look to instill, and the impact felt upon release. Milestone games will also have supplemental passages written by prominent individuals, with the legendary Alex McCullough and Audrey, aka Aitaki Mochi, talking about how the Final Fantasy VII Remake has changed their lives as creators. The book has been produced with Final Fantasy enthusiasts in mind, and if you'd like to find out more, there's a link in the description below, or you can search for the campaign on Kickstarter. If you aren't interested or able to back yourself, we would also genuinely appreciate any help you could offer in terms of getting the word out by sharing it amongst your friends and communities. So, taking things back to the 7 Remake, we know that work started over 2.5 years ago. This was divulged by Yoshinori Kitase, the game's producer, in a lengthy statement released at E3 2009 via the Square Enix blog. He said, "While the development team finishes the first game in the project, we are continuing to plan and outline the overall volume of content for the second. Due to the work already done on the first game, we anticipate development of the second game to be more efficient. We have our own internal schedule and plan, but for now, we'd like to focus our information on the first game in the project." This was then corroborated towards the end of 2019 by the game's director, Tetsuya Nomura, via another post on the Square Enix blog. He said, "We've already begun work on the next one as well, but I'm confident that playing through this title will expand your expectations, just like the world that extends beyond Midgar." Based on those initial comments from Kitase, as we are now at the end of 2021, it would be logical to assume that development of Part 2 is well underway and progressing smoothly. Nomura even used that exact word to describe the current progress of Part 2 ahead of the release of Intergrade. But Nomura has a tendency to placate, and it's difficult to understand how much timelines were affected as the team attempted to adapt to the new ways of working throughout 2020. Kitase mentioned the effect of the pandemic in a direct capacity when speaking to The Guardian in July 2020. He noted that although performance would temporarily drop below 100% efficiency as they tried to adjust to remote working, he didn't envision there being much impact on long-term planning. This was quite reassuring at the time, but some months later, Yosuke Matsuda, the CEO of Square Enix, was much less optimistic. When speaking to the Financial Times, he said, "There is also a considerable impact on the production side. It will resonate in the future. What we are selling now may have provided some positive aspects, but on the negative side, time has stood still in terms of production. We couldn't develop anything. That is where the impact will come." It's also interesting to note that there has been some indecision about the scope and scale of Part 2. When speaking within the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania, Nomura proposed that he would prefer to release the next part sooner rather than later, but doing so would require them to divide the story into smaller parts. In response, Kitase tempered that notion by stating that they would want to maintain the same level of quality and volume as the first installment. It's unclear what approach they will end up taking, but when we conducted our survey, 80% of respondents said they would rather wait longer between releases if the volume of content was larger, as opposed to having smaller games that released on a more regular basis. In many of the interviews around that time, senior figures asked fans to be patient as they waited for more concrete information about the future. But now, over 18 months on, we find ourselves in a pretty familiar situation when it comes to major games associated with Final Fantasy, as we've heard next to nothing that could be considered concrete, and with Final Fantasy XVI suffering a similar fate, and very little still known about Forspoken, despite it releasing in less than 6 months' time, it's unlikely we will hear anything anytime soon, as those games are likely to be given priority. Still, even though there's been no official reveal of Part 2, there are still plenty of things we know about what's to come. For one, the project will now be directed by Naoki Hamaguchi as opposed to Nomura. Hamaguchi was brought on board the Remake project after impressing on Mobius. He would end up being promoted to co-director and made numerous suggestions throughout development, as well as conducting a lot of interviews with the media. Nomura will now act as the creative director of the overarching Final Fantasy VII Remake compilation, which has now been expanded to include The First Soldier and Ever Crisis. And this is a pretty interesting move for numerous reasons. It's well known that Nomura did not ever seek the role of director. He ended up being assigned the position by Kitase, who, after seeing his stock continue to rise at the boardroom level, was in no position to helm the project himself. The decision to appoint Nomura was also a fantastic move from a PR perspective, given his positive association with the franchise. But with the first part now released, it was a sensible time for his transition to take place, as many fears were allayed as to the quality of the product. Hamaguchi's profile has also been raised due to the previous role as co-director and through his media duties, and from Nomura's perspective, the success of numerous Kingdom Hearts releases over the past few years has only increased the spotlight on that particular franchise, and even though he did direct 2 major games in parallel before, asking him to direct the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 and whatever's next in the Kingdom Hearts franchise at the same time would have just been unfair. Square Enix has also made an effort to make sure that Hamaguchi has been shown as a very active participant in many of the pre- and post-launch interviews, with it even being made public that it was his suggestion to have Sephiroth appear towards the end of the game in the way he did. He's also a huge fan of the original, as opposed to being part of the original group of developers, and that means Part 2 could end up having a quite different dynamic, but we'll wait and see how that pans out. What's interesting though is that Hamaguchi was chosen as the successor as opposed to Motomo Toriyama. Toriyama was Kitase's disciple, having directed Final Fantasy X-2 and the whole Final Fantasy XIII trilogy before taking over Mobius, all under the guidance of Kitase. He was also brought onto the Final Fantasy VII Remake as a co-director. Given his wealth of experience, it could have served as a redemption arc, but because of the X-2 and XIII trilogy detractors, the appointment could have also been met with negativity and skepticism. Either way, Toriyama will still have heavy involvement with the narrative, and he will work alongside Hamaguchi, Kazushige Nojima, Nomura and Kitase to deliver something that at the moment feels quite muddied in terms of direction, but that also feels intentional. Kitase has spoken about how they don't intend to make drastic changes to the original story, but it's difficult to understand what that means, as we've already seen that particular notion circumvented by what happened in Part 1. And during a talk in the 2021 Computer Entertainment Developers Conference, Kitase reiterated that they want the story to surprise those who played the original and might think they know what's going to happen. Nojima has also spoken about his desire to make the Final Fantasy VII Remake inclusive of the wider compilation, and this has been evidenced by the inclusion of characters like Nero, Weiss, Leslie and Kyrie. But the inclusion of those characters could lead to expectations being subverted if they are handled in a similar manner to how Genesis was inserted in the Nibelheim incident during Crisis Core. Following the conclusion of Intergrade, it's also clear that the writers are doubling down by including a sequence that contained Zack Fair, although it's still unclear what exactly that means. Toriyama in particular has also been very cryptic, leaving elements open to interpretation by saying things like, Jessie is not shown in the ending because we couldn't save her, or that's what you might think, and perhaps Jessie might also be spared, or not. He's also suggested that there might be 2 worlds existing in parallel. What we do know though will tie in with a small teaser that was shown at the end of Intergrade that showed the party venturing further away from Midgar. As part of this sequence, we saw Chocobo Bill pick up the party in a truck, dropping them off on the doorstep of Calm. Not only did this reintroduce Chocobo Bill as a returning NPC, it also hints that the Chocobo Farm may be a visitable location within Part 2, as within the original game players needed to venture there and catch a Chocobo so that they could safely access the Mithril Mine. We also know that this sequence will serve as a prelude to the main game, as back in May, Nomura revealed during the inaugural The First Soldier livestream that Part 2 story will start right after the events of Intergrade. As for how the narrative will play out, Hamaguchi has been clear that he wants the game to retain a story-driven focus, and that achieving that is much more important than creating an open-world experience. However, there have also been hints that, now that the party has left Midgar, that the world will be much more open. This could relate to how linear the game might be in comparison to Remake, but it could also relate to the story itself, with there now being many opportunities to be more transparent about things like the Calm incident, which was alluded to in the original Final Fantasy VII before being explored in much more detail during Before Crisis. Hamaguchi himself shared with IGN that the major challenge they now face is attempting to create an experience that showcases the vastness of the world that exists outside Midgar, and to do this, they will need to allow players to explore the world map. To work alongside with that sentiment, Nomura has also said that Part 2 will have a very different atmosphere, with huge natural elements being created, no doubt to depict elements like Fort Condor and the Mithril Mines. In addition to the original cast, we can also assume that Yuffie and Red 13 will join the ranks as playable cast members. Plans can change, of course, as for example, we know that Ramu was planned to be in Part 1 before being shelved and then brought back for Intergrade, but Hamaguchi has hinted numerous times that Red 13 will have a more prominent role to play in Part 2. Based on the effort placed around Yuffie, it would also be odd if she did not feature in Part 2, as her gameplay mechanics are already established. On the subject of gameplay, in the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania guidebook, Toriko Endo, who served as the battle director, noted that he would like to enhance gameplay further, creating something that is much more integrated, and challenging himself to push it further. Some of this was evidenced in episode Intermission, as Yuffie and Sonon were able to combine their efforts using synergy attacks, and according to Hamaguchi, some of the gameplay enhancements will feature in Part 2. We can also expect there to be a much larger array of summons available, as alongside Ramu, there's the real potential for Titan, Odin, Alexander and Phoenix to appear, as well as one of the more powerful Bahamut variants like Neo. It's also going to be very interesting to see how new types of materia are integrated into the battle system. Even though Intermission did evolve some elements, and it did introduce Ramu, it still featured very few original pieces of materia, with most recycled from Remake. But there are so many more interesting pieces of materia still to come as the Remake builds out, such as Mime, Double Cut and Deathblow, and of course, it's going to be fun to speculate what new enemy skills will be added. Outside of new content though, it was also revealed in the build-up to Intergrade that even though the PlayStation 5's adaptive triggers and haptic feedback were used for that version of the game, it was done so more as an experiment than anything else, as the support was only partial. Part 2 will make use of these features to their fullest, as well as other PlayStation 5 elements such as the SSD load times. At the moment though, it's difficult to estimate when Part 2 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake will be revealed in an official capacity. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, Square Enix Japan still has Forspoken and Final Fantasy XVI on the horizon. Forspoken is scheduled to release in spring 2022, which positions it at releasing at some point between March and June next year, and since it's been all quiet on the Final Fantasy XVI front, even if there is a big showcase during either the Game Awards or the rumoured PlayStation Experience event in December, it will be logical to assume that it won't be releasing earlier than Forspoken, which points at a Q3 or Q4 2022 release. But then again, you never know. Either way, it points at the Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 releasing at 2023 at the earliest. And that brings us to our main question for all of you. Based on what you now know, when do you think the second part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake will release? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the update, please hit that like button. As mentioned at the top, we'd also be incredibly grateful if you could support our Kickstarter campaign. The more backers we get, the bigger and better we can make the whole project. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. Very sorry for my terrible voice. I tried to delay this video as much as I could, but it didn't seem like it was getting better, and hopefully it's been okay for all of you. Either way, I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.